Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first session of day 3 of the Art of Armor, the Zoom conference benefit History Live Northeast. I am still Matt Blazek, Executive Director of History Live Northeast, and I am really happy to have with us today and introduce my friend Frank Perrin. He is a performer, a scholar, a reenactor, and someone who's very, very knowledgeable of uh, Persian culture and Persian armor, especially during the Timurid period. So I'm really excited to have him with us today. Uh, Frank, can we go ahead and let you take over and uh, introduce yourself? Talk a little bit about yourself.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. Second year, I've come in on an Art of conference, and it's always been a blast. So I appreciate you having me here. So yes, essentially, what I'm talking about today is what was going on with Persian warriors and the armor they wore during the Timurid period. Now, this is a period of history where Persian arms and armor kind of get lost. And what I mean by that is there's so much going on in that section of the world that identities tend to get muffled. As we all know, the Sasanian Empire fell after the Arab conquests in the 7th century, and it really didn't regain a lot of national rule with native Persians until the Safavid era in the 16th century. So that's like over almost 600 years of not really knowing what happened to native Persians who fought. We tend to think that Persian arms and armor just vanished for 600 years because miraculously the people who were ruling them just stopped using their armor. It's a strange thing. So we'll get into more of that in a second. So this is When Worlds Collide, Persian Armor of the Timurid period. Once again, I am Frank Perrin. I have a master's degree in public history, and I currently teach high school art history at Blacksmith Valley Prep Mayoral Academy in Cumberland, Rhode Island. You can go on to the next slide for me. And once again, just a little bit more about me and my background. I got my master's degree from Central Connecticut State University. I worked for several museums before I came to teaching high school. I just couldn't quite stay away from that age, and I really ended up just liking it. And that's now like what I've been doing full time for a couple of years. I'm also a member of the Mounted Archery Association of the Americas, so I'm actively practicing and competing in mounted archery competitions in Persian style. Go on next. All right, and now a bit about the organization. Raz Masvar, as you may or may not have heard of, is an organization that's dedicated to reviving the historical martial arts of Persia, otherwise known as Iran. No different than like HEMA, right? Except we are researching not Europe. And we're a little bit more practical in our approaches of things, doing a lot of like emphasizing a lot more live sparring and practical training scenarios. We use obviously primary sources to research arms and armor from various Persian or Persian empires. And we were founded by Dr. Manusha Khorasani, who spent 25 years, over that at least, studying Persian manuscripts, miniatures, primary source accounts to really kind of paint a picture of how Persian warriors fought. Next. So a little bit of background on this. I'm not going to bore you with too much background, but context is pretty important. So after the Mongol Empire conquered what is known as Persia, it quickly dissolved, right? It was really difficult to maintain an empire that big. So you had some of the children and successors of Genghis Khan form what was called the Ilkhanate. And that is a bunch of smaller ruling states in Persia and the areas surrounding it. And these rulers ended up relying on a lot of regional Persian smiths to make their arms and armor. Because you think about it, having a Mongolic or Turkic background as nomads, right? You don't have a lot of settled production centers. So there's this a myth kind of that comes about that all this armor that you see developing in Iran is Mongol armor. Well, it's not Mongol armor, it's Persian armor made by Persian smiths that the Mongols used. I'm not saying that Mongols didn't have their own styles to develop. They absolutely did. But more times than not, it was Persian armorers making these things, usually in the Khorasan region or Baghdad, which is, of course, part of Iraq today. And this made these armors mutually influenced. Both Persian and Mongol designs kind of blended together and to create these styles of armor. So once the Ilkhanate dissolved, a lot of local dynasties of native Persians came to power, or they merged with Mongolic or other Turkic ones. And this meant that a lot of Persian bureaucrats or warlords reclaimed old territories that they had formerly lost. All right, moving on. Now, before we get into the armor, we got good old Tamerlane. Stop me from going too fast. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them, and I'm sure Matt will direct you. But Timur was originally a very inconsequential warlord, and he began life as a cattle thief. This is like the real life Mountain Blade warband. That essentially, this guy came to power fast. And he gained influence as a member of the Barlas clan, which was his clan, which is now Uzbekistan. And in about 30 years, the dude grew enough followers and a military to reclaim the entire Ilkhanate. And he did that in 30 years. And that's a big feat. And we have to remember that he ran a very merit-based military, which is no different than what Genghis Khan had did before him. And this meant that he wasn't relying on your family, your heredity. If you can get the job done, he would take you on and promote you. Now, I know Timur did a lot of pretty horrendous things. How much of that is true and how much of that is hearsay or propaganda, we don't really know. But the one thing to his credit was that he ran a very multi-ethnic and multi-religious army. It's documented from German chroniclers that he had both Nestorian Christians and Persian Zoroastrians in his army. And that's super important to this tale of armor. And he was very sympathetic to Persian culture, and Persian styles like flourished, but they mingled with the Mongol and Turkic styles that he brought in. And he left most cities to govern themselves after he conquered them. Not all. A lot of them he razed to the ground and had piles of human skulls, like you do sometimes. But the ones that were allowed to in Iran created new Persian power centers, and that created let Persian identities reemerge and to determine new leaderships that would eventually go on to form more stabilized empires. So that's it for our context. Does anyone have any questions about the background before I go on to our armor? All right. If we don't have any questions, I will move on. All right, that's cool, Matt. Thank you. All right, so we're going to start off with some of the most famous, foremost, our helmets. So go ahead. I'm going to show 3 types. Now, this area of the world at the time was super diverse, as you've seen. I mean, you had so many different cultures blending together and so many different regional styles coming together under Timur's army that you saw so much coexisting together. And one of the most common that you see in a lot of manuscripts are these conical helms. They lack nasal guards, and they have these ear flaps. If you look at this image that's here on the right, you can see that there's ear flaps that go over where the male covers his head and his neck. And these ear flaps are either hinged, they're tied on with leather, or they're fastened in with mail. And these are most likely coming of Chinese or other Asian origins. Some people are debating whether or not they're actually Mongolic in origin or if they came from China. My belief is that they come from China, because you look at other Chinese manuscripts at the time, they look a lot closer and show a lot more lineage. If you want to go ahead and click on that on that link, Matt, that's going to bring you to a similar example from the Met, so we can see a little bit closer to what it looks like. And there we go. And this is dated roughly to the Timurid period regardless. And you can see right on the lower left hand of that helmet where the holes are. So that is where either some of the mail or ear flaps might have attached. All right, move on. Cool. So this is one of my favorites. This is a very simple domed helmet with Sasanian motifs, and this one's really cool. And it personally shows the, to me, the endurance of the Persians and how they would not let their pre-Islamic culture die. So again, this is from the late 14th, early 15th century, and at the time we had a lot of disconnect from centralized rule, right? And like I said before, this let a lot of Persian smiths kind of return to designs that they had in their past since way before the Islamic conquests. And you see the eyebrows. I don't know if you want to go ahead and give the cursor there. Those are eyebrows. And what's super cool about that is those date back to the 7th century, in particular rock reliefs that were created by the Sassanid kings. And if you go ahead and click on that link, you might have to scroll down a few pictures. Scroll down for me, right there. Go back up to the guy on the horse. So it's kind of difficult to see, and I can always give you the link later and Matt can share it off to you. But on that helmet, there are indeed small ridges that are above the eye openings on the helmet. So you have to remember, yeah, okay, yeah, you can see them. They're the ridges. So these eyebrows are a Sasanian style that are reemerging close to, close to 700 years after the Sasanian Empire fell. So it's really neat to see this. And up in this region of Iran where it came from in the northwest, there was a lot of Zoroastrians who were still practicing, and the Sasanians at the time were mostly Zoroastrian. So this could be kind of a clue that Zoroastrian warriors had really revived a lot of their style. So this always included a full aventail covering the face and under the eyes. So Matt, if you want to go ahead and bring me back to live, I'm going to grab my helmet and I'm going to bring it over so they can see one kind of in person. So here it is. You can see it has a full male aventail that comes up, covers the eyes with the same gold eyebrows that adorn it, and with the nasal guard. Now, these, historically speaking, were actually adjustable. These were some of the first adjustable sliding nasal guards that we see on record that really shows a lot of the advancement of Iranian metalsmiths at the time. So any questions about this helmet from anybody in the chat?
Yeah, I've got a question for you. The eyebrows on the helmet, are they purely stylistic or did they also serve some kind of functional purpose?
From what I'm concerned, they're essentially just stylistic. I fought in this plenty of times. I do more like traditional, what would you call harness fighting, but also I'm also an ACS member, so I do full contact like Buhurt style stuff, and like
right.
I'm very rarely hit in the face because I use a shield, like like you should do. But I have yet to feel any reason for these to be serving as a purpose. They might, and if they do, I'll gladly let you know. Parker, how is a nasal secured from sliding up and down? It's actually a screw, a threaded screw. The historical pieces actually have threaded screws. And Ken, a little extra metal. All right, so Gabriel, this is actually Persian 4-in-1 weave, and it is dome riveted mail, flat. I'm gonna go put my head back on. Was the mail hanging loosely from the helmet or some sort of padding or structure behind it, somewhere to the bottom? Okay, so This we don't have a ton of knowledge of. Padded coifs were pretty standard across all parts of the world. And my assumption from this and surviving textiles from Khorasan and Nishapur was that they were using more padded garments to support the helmet. Mine does have a padded liner sewn and riveted in, but this is just for sake of ease for me, for just some modern sport fighting context. I sincerely doubt that it was so loose to the point where you're not going to have you support underneath it. That's just a very bad choice. Going to be feeling pretty bad if you get hit. All right, I'm going to go put this helmet back on. Any other questions? Feel free to leave them in the chat. Otherwise, Matt, you can move on to the next helmet. All right, so this one you've all probably seen around a lot. You might be thinking, what is this thing doing in Persia? Well, this is the Cuman Kipchak style face mask. This is the famous one that has the big mustache, but these were actually exceedingly rare, and they came in to use in Iran with the Seljuks came in the 11th century, and the style kind of just stayed around. We don't see it pop up in manuscripts or archaeological finds a lot, but we do see in a manuscript from 1402, this warrior in the very bottom has one of those face plates. You can see it right in the middle where the helmet opens up. And that's just not his face, right? That would be a very bad decision. You're essentially just leaving a big target for someone to stab you right in the face. How much, how much does the padding and male design affect your breathing in the helmet? In the face mask helmet or in my eyebrow helmet? Eyebrow, I can breathe in that perfectly fine because there's a grill guard in that one. For modern aspects, there's a grill guard that allows me to breathe. And the historical ones, there wouldn't have been padding in front of the male, I'm assuming. It would have just been male for you to breathe through. So you would have been a little weaker there, a little less padded there, but I can breathe in that thing perfectly fine. I have no hindrance. Of course, I train a lot. Hope that helps. So these faceplate helmets, some of them had hinges, right, where you could actually open your visor up. Not all of them did, but a lot of them had that. And these were exceedingly rare. And there's actually a lot of debate around whether or not they were actually used in combat. There's plenty of ones that pop up in museums from the 16th century that look a little worn, look a little beat up. Again, it could be stylized. It could be ceremonial. I don't know. Either way, these are helmets that show up. And this lecture was about helmets and armor, not necessarily whether or not they were necessarily used. I dig the freckle holes and ask, oh, so what that is, those are just preparations. That's to help me breathe a little bit better. The historical examples didn't have those, but of course, for sports style combat, you're fighting a little bit differently. I have those preparations placed in there just so I could have a little bit more room for my oxygen supply. Any questions about the helmets before we move on to some body armor? Breathing is overrated. All right, cool. So, is this type of mask the influence of Roman chivalry or signifier? That's a very good question. I'm gonna say not, only because again, it's originally a Seljuk design. It's a Turkic design they made its way to Persia. It seems like there's a lot of cultures that had face masks on their armor. That's, to me personally, kind of a stretch, but the two cultures interacted. I wouldn't necessarily rule it out. I just don't think it's a huge probability. But those masks are cool though. All right, so lamellar is was actually what you see me wearing on the left here. That's me with my face mask helmet on. And lamellar was the most commonly used type of armor in Persia until the 15th century. And this comprised of hundreds of plates. Thank you, Evan. hundreds of plates are laced together with leather or actually even silk thread. People hear that Islam it's forbidden to use silk in Islam. Well, the Persians didn't exactly listen to that. They didn't actually follow a lot of that to a T. Plus, if you're a Zoroastrian, you don't have to listen to the silk rule anyway because you're not Muslim. Now, these are hardened plates that overlap, and they create a very flexible but protective surface. And people say, oh, lamellar can't be any stronger than European plate armor. Well, it is, not stronger, but it's just as protective. The only difference is that you're creating a layer of flexibility. You still have just as much steel overlapping, but now it's just more flexible. I've taken mace hits with that armor before, and to me, it didn't feel any different than plate. Again, you can't compare two different cultures who fought differently in different ways, but there's a huge debate over the protectiveness of lamellar. Well, they used it until the 1400s, so I would say it was pretty protective. Sometimes it's paired with large leather bands to reinforce it, like the example on the right. And oftentimes underneath it, it was reinforced by a kazagand, which is a kaftan, like the one I'm wearing, but in between the layers of fabric, there's actually mail. There's chain sewn in between. So that is some of the earliest examples of Persian armor in the Timurid period. That was what was considered probably like the most common. And that, again, that doesn't vanish until the early 15th century. And this is something the Sasanians were wearing in the 500s. So it had a very long lifespan. Anything about the lamellar?
Yeah, I've actually got a question. This is going to be kind of related to both of your segments so far. I've seen some examples of helmets made from laced lamellar. Were they super common in this period or at all?
Oh, so, okay, that's actually like an Avar or a Magyar kind of helmet.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, that's a little bit earlier, but there were some helmets in this period that had lamellar aventails. So instead of chain, it'd be a solid steel top, but the chain would be replaced by an aventail. Like the face mask helmet that I showed you in the last slide, that's not chain around the face. That's all lamellar.
Very cool. Very cool.
Yeah, definitely. I just opted not for that because I like to breathe.
Breathing's good.
All right, thank you. We can go on to the next one. All right, so next one, there's still lamellar helmets around, but most likely in Tibet. Lamellar helmets mostly phased out. Yeah, thank you, Evan. I was gonna mention Tibet. So Tibet is a really cool place, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art actually has a full suit, well, almost full suit. It's everything but the pauldrons of a full suit of leather lamellar armor, and it's really nice. Like Tibet did some amazing work with leather lamellar, and that was being used until like the 1600s. So I highly recommend you check out the Met's stuff, Tibetan stuff. It's beautiful. All right, so laminar is an interesting one. Now laminar is just as you think it is, right? Laminated bands of things. Hold on, Andrew. Yeah, I was in the Tibetan. Yeah, it's pretty mental. The fact that it's still surviving, right? It's wild. So laminar, as you said, as I said before, it's just originally bands of hardened leather that come together, that are late overlapping each other. Now, it was commonly worn by the Mongols, but also by Persians much earlier in time. But you can see in more Mongol manuscripts how commonly it's worn by them. Now, that makes sense, right? Because the Mongols were nomadic peoples. They didn't have a lot of permanent manufacturing centers, had a lot of access to leather with the animals that they could have hunted, right? So they hardened these leather bands, and they would put them in long strips protecting their body. But eventually these morphed into long bands of steel. And it gave you, again, some of the same kind of flexibility and mobility, but a little bit less. But it still allowed you to cover very vital parts of your body, especially if you couldn't afford, right, full body protection. But you still had something solid in your torso, your squishy bits. And oftentimes it was sewn or riveted into heavy felt, leather, or reinforced fabrics, and sometimes reinforced with plates. So you also had a lot of these that were completely covered, which gave you like a brigandine style of armor. So yes, brigandines existed in Persia too. The Mongols actually had them, which were called the Hatangu Dagels, with their own similar style. And the steel variants fell out of use by the mid 15th century because they slowly got replaced with the next style of armor that's coming up. But before we go on to that, if we can go back to the live video, I'm going to bring you all over to my armor so you can check it out here in the back. All right, so I have a new suit of lamellar being made right now. I was hoping to have it for today, but I don't. It's still in Russia being produced. Because my old lamellar, I got too big for it. Just I put on too much muscle mass. I know, poor me, but I had to get a bigger suit. So this is my laminar brigandine hybrid, and I have more plates underneath here, as you can see, to reinforce it. Not completely historically inaccurate, but more than likely, this actually just would have been reinforced with mail or like a hardened felt or leather backing. And this goes all the way around the sides. And the steel plates continue on the back. Do you have any questions about this? Yes. Incredibly. But yeah, it's really fun to move in, extend all the way down to the ground. Again, it's like a robe. It's like a long caftan. And it's super comfortable. I can actually ride in it too. All right. No other questions? I'm going to come back. Thank you, Bryce. All right, so we go on to the next kind of armor. All right, so this is mail and plate, and you've probably seen this, recognizing it more so as Ottoman than anything else. Also not true. The Turks did not develop this. It first shows up in Iranian manuscripts in the very, very end of the 14th century, but very rare, incredibly. And the piece on the bottom here from the Met is actually a 16th century piece, but it just shows you a rough analogy of what they look like. And these coexist with other styles at the time, but again, incredibly rare. The plate is physically sewn, or riveted into male shirts or legs. So it's kind of taking the best of both worlds with bigger plates and lamellar and combining it into one item, right? But you've still got the addition of mail in the armpits and other areas of that you need for movement and protection. Examples of 4 pieces, right? They replace all other styles by at least the mid 15th century. Lamellar and brigs are not really being used that much, way past the 1450s. At that point, they're pretty much all gone. So, any questions about that? All right, if not, we can move on. Arm and hand protection. All right, this one, I got some fun stuff to show. So you can go on to the first version. All right, these are bazubans. You've probably heard of them. Bazubans are protections that primarily cover the wrist to the elbow, and they open up in the middle either with a hinge or mail. And I'm going to show you my examples in a second once I get through them. And they, as you can see here, there's those small discs that are on top of the hand with the archers. It's going to provide some partial thumb protection and hand protection. So that way you can still shoot a bow unhindered. If you can head back to that, Austin, thank you. Contrary to popular belief, during this time period, hands weren't completely unprotected in this part of the world. They say, oh, well, there's no surviving archaeological evidence of hand protection in Iran or the Middle East. Like, you're right, not in the Middle East, but Iran doesn't encompass the entire Middle East. Sure, the Turks don't have them. Maybe the Indians don't have them. The Arabs don't have them, but the Persians sure as hell have them. So we can't blanket statement the Middle East when Iranian manuscripts clearly show that they have some versions of hand protection. Granted, Timur didn't use Persian horse archers. He preferred his Central Asian horse archers to Persian ones. He preferred heavier Persian cavalry and a lot of infantry. But we have to remember Persian cavalry, just because they were heavier, we have manuscripts saying they were still trained to shoot a bow as well. So yes, there were specialty classes, but a lot of Persian warriors didn't just neglect their horse archery past because they weren't necessarily being used for it. And also manuscript Bazabans are cool because they allow the user to actually use them as a secondary shield if they lose their shield. That's spoken about in a few manuscripts, using your forearm to defend. All right, so let's go to the next picture. All right, so you also see towards the end of the Timurid, towards the end of the early Timurid period, full hand coverage. And the Jalarid Empire, who fell quickly to Timur, some of their manuscripts show Bazabans, but with full integrated hand protection. And these are long plates that are put together with rivets and other forms of another mail. And this provides full finger coverage, and the hand is connected with chain. So although full hand protection in Iran is rare during the Timurid period, it absolutely existed. So if we can come back to me for a second, I'm going to grab you one of my Bazabans so I can show you something cool. All right, so this is a more accurate pair of Bazabans. Bazaban with full hands. Yeah, that does show up there too. I forgot about that one. Thank you for reminding me. No, later on in time, what happens is towards the beginning of the 1500s in Persia, you see Bazabans like all over the place with full hand protection. It just takes a little while to get there for their use. So this is a Bazaban created a little more accurately. But I do have a holdover here from, believe it or not, it's actually a LARP company. I have a holdover here before a real one gets crafted for me. But I have a pair that I found that has the integrated hand protection, just throwing it on now. So as you see, this Bazaban provides just enough protection. Now, what's super neat about this is, again, I can shoot my bow with absolutely no hindrance, even in a thumb draw, like I'm supposed to. I'm not going to shoot anyone in my apartment, I promise. But again, I can hit that thumb grasp perfectly fine here. And there's absolutely no problem with me drawing the bow. So that's why they had the partial hand protection, so they could shoot their bows. And when they got on foot, they had enough hand protection for foot combat as well. And if I have my Shamshir, just enough solid protection to move my Shamshir. All right, so let's move on to the last line of protection that we have, and that is down on the legs. So feel free to go ahead and go to our last one. So these are called sakban. Are there inner straps or added? Okay, so Emma, yeah, I've seen some inner straps on some Indian examples before, but not a lot from Persia. Those just feel, inner straps for me are just a lot safer concerning any kind of fighting that I'm doing. So sakbans are full protection from the shins up to the knee. Now, this is interesting because in a lot of European harness, you see thigh protection that attaches to knees, right? Especially like in for examples like Gothic plate armor, even some Burgundian legs, for example. This doesn't exist with Persian during the Timurid period because you had your lamellar tassets, or as you saw, the fabric from your laminar covering your thighs. Also, to me, as a horseback archer, having all of that come together on your legs, to me personally, with the way I control a horse, would make it a lot more difficult for me to feel contact from the horse with all of that connected, covering my legs and my inner thighs. Yes, Persian style can leave your inner thighs more exposed, but if you're dumb enough to strike at my inner thighs, I'm going to stab you in the face, personally. That's just my idea. Plus, I have a shield. So I've never had any problems with my inner thigh being hit. So I like that mobility and ability to command my horse. And I'm going to show you this example that I have for the Sakban, and then we're going to open up for questions for the last couple minutes. So here is my Sakban. As you can see, the knees and the shins are connected by chain. The sides are hinges. And I do have these straps. Fred, yeah, absolutely. You can get in contact from Matt, and I'd love to talk about it. These can actually tie into arming points on your padded pants if you so desire them to. I've actually also pulled them up to a belt as well, just to provide some extra support. But the tension on this strap does give me enough to keep this on my leg. Actually also contours very nicely to the top of your foot. So with that in mind, I will wrap up just by saying this was a very transitionatory period. Jeff, so I see hinges are also used. Yeah, I think the mail in certain places is super useful, right? Because if you are on the go, that is so much easier for you to fix than having to rely on hinges. I can't tell you the amount of fights that I've done for Bohurt style where I have taken a hit and yeah, the chain broke, but it's such an easy fix. And I see other people whose hinges get screwed up and it takes them a lot more time to fix it. They teach their own, but to me, it was just a lot easier because I'm not an armorer. So it's easier for me. Were riders who protected by armor or steps? So there are some examples of sabatons, right? I have not seen a lot of them, especially in the early Timurid period. I have not seen sabatons. But the stirrups were just normal stirrups. So from what I've seen, if you find other evidence, great. I have not seen a lot of other evidence of foot armor for that. So with that in mind, my conclusion on this before I wrap it up, open up for questions, is essentially this was a transitionatory period where a lot of stuff was coming into favor and falling out of favor. And I think the reason why the Persian identity gets lost so much is because, yeah, Parker, definitely. And I think the reason why Persian identity gets lost so much during this time period is because we tend to classify armor in the Middle East, at least, by who ruled the area. And that's not necessarily fair. It neglects the warriors who comprised of militaries. It neglects the smiths who make them. And it neglects just overall the general diversity of the populations of the region. Persian warriors didn't just vanish for 600 years. They were incorporated into different armies. And they fought and were important. The Battle of Ankara, where the Timur beat Ottoman Sultan Bayezid, there was mostly Persian infantry at that battle. And that's who decided the day at the end. The horse archers played a very important part. But in the end, it was the infantry that tracked down the Sultan and took him captive. So again, I think the reason Persian identity gets lost is because we neglect the subtleties of the time period. So any questions before we wrap this up?
Yeah,
I know I'm a little shorter than.
Yeah, folks, I forgot to tell you that this is going to be a little shorter of a session this morning because Frank has to go compete in an archery competition.
Yeah, our competition got pushed back a little bit. We haven't been able to do much for the last 2 weeks because Rhode Island has been bombarded with snow. So we haven't been able to do much. So yeah, I saw a question pop up. What was that?
It says, can you talk about your experience of using the small shield with armor?
Oh, the Separ. Okay. So Separs, especially the small one, those aren't popping up. Those aren't popping up until a little bit later, like during Safavid period. At this point, you still have medium and large shields. I enjoy the Separ, but the small one, if I'm against someone with a long sword, no, screw you people. I'm going in there with a big shield to hide behind, because you longsword fighters are the bane of my existence. And I mean that in the most respectful way. Yeah.
Fred asks, can you talk about your interactions with the Persian American community?
Shockingly, I haven't had a ton. The ones that I have interacted with have been mostly from Renaissance festivals. And there are a lot of Iranian families who have been here for a few generations. And what's been remarkable is that they've said, we appreciate that you have portrayed Iranians and Persians in such a positive light, when it's hard for us to go places and not be vilified. It's been an incredibly moving experience. So you talk about the saddle you were using, what differences armor has combat horseback archery. So with my group, we haven't gotten a chance to use a lot of historical saddles quite yet. The Mounted Archery Association of the Americas is more of like a general encompassing sport style of mounted archery. Getting a Persian or Mongol saddle is on my to-do list. So once I play around with that, I personally use an English saddle. It feels a lot better for me, but I've heard that Western is a little more akin to like nomadic style saddles. I just feel better in English, but once I get a more appropriate one, I will be sure to let you all know.
Andy Volpe is being greedy here, and he actually has 3 questions put into one. So he says, the first part of it, of the common misconceptions and myths you get, what one do you enjoy dispelling? The second part is, what is the most difficult, complicated myth to address? And the third is, any fun stories with interactions with kids or general public?
All right, so most common one I'm misconceiving is that the Persians weren't part of the Crusades. People don't get that, right? The Crusades were a particularly Arab and Turkic ordeal. During the time of the Crusades, the Persians weren't involved really militarily in that. They were either under foreign control and not allowed to fight. During the time of the First Crusade, Persian warriors weren't allowed to fight. They were not allowed to fight. They were administrators. They weren't allowed to fight because the Sasanians had spent so long actively resisting. So Persians couldn't fight. And literally, even then, during the Crusades, Persian warriors would have been on the side of the Crusaders most of the time, because you had the Mongol Crusader alliance against the Caliphate. So that's my favorite one I enjoy. It blows their mind. The most difficult one getting through to people is actually not about armor. It's about that Shamshirs didn't miraculously start to just curve in the 17th century, because I've heard that. They believe they went from straight to suddenly curved in the 17th century. And I'm like, there's literally dozens of manuscripts that show these things gradually curving more and more over time, written relative to the time periods we're in question. But because we don't have archaeological examples of them between the 6th and 17th centuries curving, that's impossible.
If anybody wants to get more into that, Frank actually gave a talk last year at the Art of the Sword conference about Shamshirs, and talked a little bit about that.
And our scimitars aren't real, but I'm not going to get into that today. All right, so the next thing, before I get out of here, the last part of that question, I believe, was what's the best interaction you've had with the public? And that's essentially just anytime I get someone from the Middle East who is just so happy to see me representing something positively. I have Amazigh ancestry. So someone mentioned Morocco, but I have ancestry from North Africa and Spain. And anytime that I get a chance to, I know it's different regions, but in general, I know that feeling. You know, all the time, someone who's Amazigh has to face a lot of misconceptions, right? Like the fact that we keep getting called Berbers And like, no, that means barbarian. So if you could stop using that word, that'd be great. So I understand what it's like to have misconceptions about especially parts of the Middle East and North Africa. Not as bad as others, but I of course still feel for them.
Well,
So
Frank,
any other,
I know you got to
Yeah.
get going, but I have that one final question for you, most important question of the conference.
yes.
What's your favorite armor?
Lamellar. Yeah, Lamellar's my favorite. But last time I was asked that, what's your favorite sword? And I said the spear.
You did. That's right.
So that's my favorite sword. So, well, thank you all so very, very much. It was great to be back. Any other questions, Matt? Please feel free to have them directed to me on my email.
Certainly, I will do that. Thank you so much for joining us today, Frank.